Now that you've seen how to add the isolate scope property into a directive and the difference between shared and isolate scope, let's look at how we can kind of punch a hole in that isolate scope wall. So earlier I showed you this, and we talked about how once you isolate the scope, you really can't talk between the outside world and this internal world of the directive. So what do we do there? Well, what we can do is use some different symbols in AngularJS, and you're going to see three of them in this module. We have an @ an equals, and an ampersand. The first one we're going to talk about is the @, and it represents a string value that we really want to get through that wall and over into the directive. And that's kind of what we're after here. Now, I like to think again as the @ as being building a pipeline through this wall. And maybe there's a little sign right above the pipe and it has the @ symbol. And that means, hey, you can pass me a string value, and we'll usually give it an alias, a property name. And then that will kind of flow through the pipe and get into the directive. All right, so it works like this. If we had a guy named Dave over here on the left and we have our directive on the right, well, right now the directive doesn't have a value. But if we use this @ property, and we call this a local scope property, then we can create a one-way binding between this object and this object and pass Dave in as a string, but it's only one way. If we change Dave over here, it's not going to go backwards. So, this person may say, hey, I'm Dave, and the directive then gets that value through this pipeline, this property. And if Dave ever changes over here, though, this one over here never knows. It's just a one-way type of binding. Now, from a code standpoint, it looks like this. Let's assume that we have a controller of some type that has a first property for first name, and we want to get this Dave value into this directive in the blue box here. And you'll notice that the directive, though, has isolate scope, so it has that wall built up. Can't see anything from the outside world. Well, one way you can punch a hole through the wall is to define a property in the directive. Now, this is only specific to the directive itself. And in the case of the @ that is what we're going to say you can pass. Now, what that means is you can pass a string value into me. Now, anytime you see an @ it also means, again, it's a one-way binding. So if you change it in the directive, it is not going to go back out and influence the the parent scope that's outside there. So it would look like this. If we had a directive called my directive, and we want to get this Dave value into the wall or across the wall, then we can take the name of our local scope property on the directive, which is name, and just think of anything that's in these squiggly brackets is literally being a property of the directive. So we have name on the directive, and then the value you want to pass in, because it's a string value, we just do a data binding expression. And when that gets resolved at runtime, then Dave will automatically be passed in. And now the name will equal Dave inside of the directive. And that's kind of the fundamentals of how we can poke a hole in that wall to get some data from the outside world into the directive. Now, what's nice about this is from a directive standpoint, you know exactly the properties to look for now because you define them. Whereas with a shared type of scope, you might try to get to a customer property like we did earlier, but it may not be there. And so that directive wouldn't be that useful unless you can be absolutely sure that the parent scope has a customer property. Well, in this case, you defined the pipeline name that goes through this wall, and so you absolutely know it's going to be name. Now, it may or may not have a value because it's up to the user of the directive to actually use the value of the property. But that's the basics of how it kind of works. So let's jump into a quick demonstration, and I'll show you this in action.